All right, I will go ahead and get started with just a couple housekeeping notes. First off, welcome everybody. I welcome to this session on the Government Funding Resources Workshop. I am Maureen MacArthur-Hart with Global Genes, and we also have with us from Global Genes, Hira, and I apologize, Chowdhury. There she is. And if you have any questions, we'll be helping monitor the Q&A box and the chat box as well. So before we start, though, I do want to review just a few brief housekeeping notes. So first, all of the attendees are muted right now by the host in order to reduce any interruptions. We really encourage you, though, to use the chat function for any questions that you have throughout the session. And again, Hira and I will make sure that those questions get to the speakers as best as possible. To open the chat, please click on the chat button that's located on the meeting controls that are at the bottom or at the top of your screen, which is near the mute icon. And if there are any questions that we're not able to get to due to running short on time, we'll do our best to follow up after the event. If you have any technical difficulties or any questions about the program as a whole, please do visit the help desk in the main lobby, and we have a tech team there from MyCityMed as well as Global Genes staff members to answer questions. And finally, we do encourage you all to participate as active listeners. Take advantage of this opportunity to hear from our experts and ask questions. This program is really your time to learn and to find answers on critical challenges in rare disease research. And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers. PJ Brooks from the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at NIH, David Wright from North Carolina State University, and Sean Ekins from Collaborations Pharmaceuticals. They're each going to share a little bit more about their background as we go into the conversation. And for now, I'll have PJ Brooks from NCATS get started to kick things off.
Great, thanks, Maureen. So, yeah, my name is PJ Brooks. I'm from the Office of Rare Diseases Research at NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. And if some of you heard the keynote yesterday from Chris Austin, my boss and the director of NCATS, I hope that gave you a sense of what we're all about. The Office of Rare Diseases Research, as the name indicates, is specifically focused on rare diseases and all of them. And so we're really focused on how we can accelerate translation for all rare diseases and rather than focusing on individual ones. And so since this is a discussion about government funding resources, and I'm representing the government here, I'm happy to discuss some of the funding opportunities we have at the NIH. Many of you are probably familiar with the typical NIH grants that are given to individual scientists who are usually doing or traditionally have been doing basic research. And this is just basic money that people get to do research in their laboratories. And that is the bulk of the funding that comes from NIH. But for this meeting, I want to talk about some other funding opportunities very briefly, and then we can follow up later. And there's three in particular I wanted to highlight. One is that we fund grants for research meetings. And these can be for any kind of, actually for any kind of scientific meeting, but what we're particularly interested in here are grants for meetings that are often held by rare disease groups, particularly to set a research agenda. And one of the common ones we see are groups where there's maybe a new identification of a new disease or a new cluster of diseases, and some of the patient advocates want to get some of the scientists together to kind of set up a research agenda and develop collaborations. And that's a pretty common type of research grant that we would be looking at funding. They're called R13s. And I just posted in here a link to the official NIH website that talks about how you can look at these. I didn't make slides of these because frankly, they're kind of boring slides to look at, but I'll post some of the links on the side there. So that's one certainly that patient advocates might take advantage of. I would very much encourage you to do that, though, working with investigators and people who have gotten NIH grants before, because applying for NIH grants is unfortunately not a trivial thing to do, and I'm sure Sean can tell you about that. there's a fair amount of process that you have to know how to do. And research, universities that do research, they kind of have all that set up. So starting to do that by yourself as an individual or a family group, I would not really recommend it. But I do think you can play a key role in getting people together to do those grants. Also, NIH funds research on clinical trials, including clinical trials in rare diseases. And typically the people who apply for that funding are investigators who are going to be running the clinical trials. But there's a real case where active participation of patient advocates is really critical. Because if you're going to do a clinical trial in a rare disease, we would really want to see that you've reached out to the relevant patient advocacy groups, because that's how you're going to get the people to participate in the trial. And if you haven't done that, I think that's going to be a problem. So certainly there's another opportunity. And also, of course, we fund at NIH grants for small businesses. Actually, it's a law that part of our budget, part of the budget of every NIH institute and center has to go to support research carried out by small businesses. And there again, some of these are focused on rare diseases. And this is a good opportunity, I think, if I'm going to hand over to Sean, because he certainly participated in some of those. And I'll be happy to discuss and answer questions about any of these funding opportunities later in the session.
Thank you so much. And yes, we'll now turn it over to our next speaker, which I apologize, I've already forgotten the order, with David.
Yes. Okay, so I have a few slides real quick. Let me get them shared. My name is David Wright. I'm the Director for Project Management in the Computer Science Department at NC State University. And what I do is provide project management support for mid-scale research projects, research-oriented projects that don't have the budget for full-time permanent people. So I've been involved with the Rare Disease InfoHub, which is a joint project between NC State and University of North Carolina for a little over a year now. And so it's an interesting project, and it's kind of an example of how funding has worked and how we're hoping it's going to work in the future. So it's a little bit different perspective on things. So what is the InfoHub? The need was identified several years ago by some folks in North Carolina, that there was a need for updated and curated knowledge resources primarily for the patient community, but also for researchers and physicians, and that those resources needed to be driven by these stakeholders and not by somebody who thinks they know what's needed, but actually by the people who are using the knowledge resources. So the InfoHub is a web portal that sits at the nexus of these stakeholders. We use a lot of analytics technologies to help meet these various different needs, and with the goals of providing resources that will help identify and diagnose rare diseases, provide support to practitioners, clinical practitioners, as well as to researchers, and most importantly, provide resources to the patient community about general knowledge about the disease, about diseases, about treatments, about research, access to therapies, to experts when they're available, a whole variety of different things. Okay, my slides are, there we go. So again, it's a stakeholder-driven portal. One thing that I think sets us apart in many respects is that we're not focused on a single disease or single group of diseases, but we're working to provide information and knowledge resources across all rare diseases, and providing that from high-level descriptive information down to disease-specific research, clinical trials, and the details that can help people as when they're ready for it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The problem that we face and that the community faces is there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of information out there, but it's spread out all over the place, and many times is not complete, and it's not always presented to different audiences in the best way. So what we're doing is trying to transform a lot of this knowledge or this information into actionable knowledge that people can actually use. It is a work in progress, and something that we're actively continuing to develop. And as a portal type platform, we're also, it's a research project, but it's also a portal for research projects. So the URLs on the slides, I would invite you when you have a chance to take a look at it. It would take me too long to give it a decent demonstration here. But just as a high level kind of description, we're taking a variety of data sources from public websites, from biomedical pharma databases, as well as we're working towards incorporating unstructured data. So this could be in the form of social media, of transcripts of one of the things that we're working directly with right now is transcripts of a public radio program called The People's Pharmacy, and analyzing this data, trying to make sense of it, trying to apply meaning to it, and integrating it with these other sources of knowledge into this curated knowledge base that we can then deliver directly to users, as well as provide access to other research tools. So one of the things that we're looking at, for example, is a tool that would take information that we can glean from unstructured data and match it with information from research publications, and find commonalities that may provide researchers or physicians insights into new treatments or therapies. Another project that we're working on is a dramatically new user interface technology that would be adaptive to a user's learning experience. So when you start, when a patient is, or a patient's family receives a new diagnosis, they can't deal in many cases with all the details. It's a learning process that happens over time. And so we're looking at building the technology behind building a user interface that will learn with a user, as well as support and guide that learning experience based on the learning experiences of other people in the past. So our funding history, getting down kind of to the meat and potatoes of this workshop, we started out with a UNC system-wide Research Opportunities Initiative grant. It was a little over $2 million over 3 years, from 2018 to this year. It was the effort funded by this was North Carolina centric, because it's coming out of the University of North Carolina system. And it's building on an existing bioscience and innovation infrastructure that's been 25 to 30 years in the making across the state of North Carolina. The public universities that are directly collaborating in our research efforts include NC State and UNC Chapel Hill, as well as North Carolina Central and UNC Pembroke. So we're not just a single group, a single perspective. We're bringing different perspectives into it. And this is the vision that we're developing, or we've developed and are moving forward on. So we have a quadrant, or a leg of the technology and analytics the tools that we're using to deal with large and diverse and many times unstructured um, information. We're merging efforts with pharma and biomedical informatics. So the UNC Catalyst for Rare Diseases is a key part of this, using technology and analytics with pharma and biomedical information to do things like investigating drug repurposing and new drug discovery and so forth, based on just getting insights, not necessarily confirming things, but getting insights on it. And then the third pillar of our vision is the patients and community, which is really what drives the whole thing. And there's a boundary area here, the community engagement with pharma and biomed in clinical trials and feedback on drugs and therapy and so forth. There's a boundary between the technology and the patients and community, which we're envisioning as Taylor's Tale Gateway. Talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And the Rare Disease Info Hub sits here at this nexus of all three. So we connect technology with, or the analytics technology with pharma and biomedical, with patients and community, and collect and deliver information and actionable knowledge and resources. So this is where we're hoping to go. The critical aspects of what I'm involved with are in this Taylor's Tale Gateway space here, of bringing the technology more closely to the patient and family community. Getting my screen to advance. So this is where we're moving. We're looking at a full public launch sometime this fall, probably September, early October. We're building collaborative partnerships, primarily right now with taylorstale.org. And just because Sharon King and several of the people on the Taylor's Tale Advisory Board have been critical partners and strategic partners in the development of the InfoHub and in connecting us with the broader community of stakeholders that have helped guide us in the knowledge that we're delivering through the InfoHub. But we're also looking at other nonprofit organizations and foundations and looking to leverage university system support, as well as building an infrastructure for through a membership center at NC State and or UNC together. Legal folks are still ironing out what we need to do there, but building a membership center that would allow corporate partners to provide a small, relatively small membership fee annually, but get the advantage of the larger research funding that their combined efforts can do. And this is a model that's actually been around since the 1950s with NSF, National Science Foundation, and the industry university cooperative research centers, but doing this at the kind of local level as opposed to a national level. So this is where we're going and how we're hoping to get there. And I hope this helps, and be happy to answer questions all that I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And now we'll hear from Sean.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sean Ekins. I'm the CEO and founder of Collaborations Pharmaceuticals, and hopefully you can see my slides. We are a small company based in North Carolina, in Raleigh. Today I'm going to share a little bit of my background and also my experience of going after and obtaining grant funding and how it's enabled us to build companies. So I wanted to begin with a little bit of background. I have 20 plus years of experience in drug discovery, worked at large pharmas and a number of small companies. And I've been fortunate to, I guess, work for a number of smaller companies, and they've been pretty much reliant on initially NIH funding to get them going. So my first experience of going after an NIH grant was back in 2004, 2005 with a small company based in Michigan. And we didn't get it on the first go, but on the second submission, I was able to get a phase 2 SBIR. And that pretty much was the foundation for a little company called GeneGo. And that a few years later went on to be bought by Thomson Reuters. And after that, I worked for a number of other companies, essentially as a senior scientist or different kinds of levels. But I was really using my ability to then go after these grants, write them, work with other scientists, collaborate with them to try to see if we could get funding. And after that, I worked with a number of little biotechs afterwards. Snowden was one of them. We got about 3 STTRs in a year. And then I was with another company in San Francisco, CDD, for 8 years, and I was able to be the PI on 4 of these small business grants. And sort of concurrent with that, I connected with a rare disease family and had this idea that maybe they could start a rare disease company. And that happened in 2011 when I met Jill Wood. We founded Phoenix Nest. It took us a few years to go after small business grants, but we were able to get 5 of them over about 4-year period and raise about $7.5 million for developing treatments for Sanfilippo syndrome. And then parallel with that, I realized that I could take this approach and leverage it to form another company, which is my current company, Collaborations Pharmaceuticals. And we've been able to get about 16 grants, and I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on those in a few moments. But essentially, the point I wanted to make here is that over 15 years, we've been able to bring in pretty reasonable amount of money that's been able to hire people and get work done in a number of different areas. So Collaborations Pharmaceuticals, we founded it in 2015, and initially it was just me, no angel or VC funding. And as I said, over the last 4 years or so, we've been able to get, for this company, about $7.5 million of funding as well. And this has enabled us to basically get a number of projects on the go. Some of them are early stage, preclinical, some of them are much later stage. And it's enabled us to go after and apply for 8 FDA orphan drug designations for different diseases. Some of these are rare diseases and some of them are neglected. And we've also been able to apply for several patents and provisionals and submitted several trademarks. And one point I should make is that we can't use any grant funding whatsoever to go after legal type of applications. So patent filing, trademark filing, we basically have to pay for ourselves. But a lot of the research that we've been able to do on some of the diseases I'll show is funded by the grants. So that's an important point actually to make, how you can use the money that you are able to win for grants. So this slide shows a little brief outline of a pipeline. And so we've been able to obtain a number of grants and then leverage those for a number of rare and neglected diseases. Some of those that are furthest along include Batten disease, which is a project where we sort of found a disease treatment that was on the shelf. It wasn't doing much. Researcher wasn't able to get R01 funding. And so I applied for small business grant funding, and we were lucky enough to get a phase 1 grant and start that going with another academic collaborator. And then we've been able to work on a number of other rare diseases separately. But the key thing here is that a number of the programs that we've been working on are either NIH or DoD funded. And we've been able to work over a number of years with different groups at NIH. So the money is coming from different parts of the NIH. And another important point to make on this slide is that not all of these grants are small business grants. And so as a small company, you don't have to go after small business grants. You can go after R01 grants, you can go after R21s, UG2, UG3 type grants. So there's really no limitation. And we've also been able to go after DoD funding as well. So it's important to realize that DoD has money for rare diseases. So as a small company, not only do we find assets that are out there with academic collaborators, and we try to work with them to take them further, but we put a lot of effort into using our machine learning expertise and applying that to rare and neglected diseases. And in order to complement the funding that we get from grants, we're also able to leverage our technologies to go after contract services. And we provide those to large pharma and also consumer product companies. But our focus as a company is primarily on early stage drug discovery, hit to lead, and we work with a number of different groups, academic groups, not-for-profit groups, as well as other companies. So how do you do it? What do you really need in order to get going after some of these types of grants as a small company? Initially, my focus was on small business grants. That was how I got into working on grants. I wasn't an academic. I had no background in writing grants before joining Jingo. And so there was a little bit of a learning curve. But I would say important things, if you're going to take it on, if you've never written a grant, you have to be able to simply write. If you've written papers or reports or written anything, basically, it's just structuring your thoughts in a way that other people can understand it. To go after a small business grant, it's important, especially if you're doing an STTR, that you have an academic collaborator and you have scientific credibility. If you're not a scientist yourself, it's going to be very difficult to get one of these grants. But if you're working with an academic collaborator, I think that's a critical piece of this. And you need a scientist really as a principal investigator. I think it would be very difficult without having someone with a scientific background to try to apply for one of these grants. You also obviously need a company. In order to apply for a small business grant, you have to do about 5 different registrations on government websites. You should give yourself several weeks to do this. And you need a company to be able to apply for these small business grants. You're not going to be able to get one of these without all of these registrations. You're not even going to be able to submit the grant without the registrations. And clearly at the beginning, you also need to have an idea. You need to have something that is, it could be a molecule, it could be a device, it could be software. You could be responding to a particular request that, say, the NIH or the DoD has. It could be a clinical trial, for example. Really, it's hard to define exactly what the grant has to be, but there are certainly some key areas that hopefully it fits within your area of expertise. That should be a given. If you're going too far away from your area that you work on, it may be hard to show credibility. And it's also important in many of these small business type grants to have some preliminary data. Not every grant type requires preliminary data, but a lot of these small business grants, you'll get a lot further if you have something to go with. And it doesn't have to be something that you've done. It could be that collaborators have published on, or you've seen other people publish on, but use that as preliminary data, a proof of concept. And as PJ said, there is a lot of money that's set aside here at the NIH in the order of many hundreds of millions of dollars. And for the Department of Defense, it's about $1 billion every year for small business grants. And so why should you go after these types of grants? Really, the pay line is much higher than academic grants. If you're an academic watching this presentation, you're used to going after R21s and R01s, etc., which are incredibly competitive. That's not to say that small business grants are not competitive. They are, but the pay line is normally much higher, in the order of 20 or 30 as the score. In order to go after these grants as an academic, you need to have a company, or you need to be working with a company as well. So that's important to remember. One other take home is that this money is essentially free. There's really not a lot of strings attached to it. And so if you do have a company, this is what's called non-dilutive. So it's not like a VC or angel is ultimately, they're pulling the strings. The NIH isn't really pulling the strings on this money. Once you've got it, you have reporting requirements that you have to comply with. And there's obviously a lot of regulations, but the money is yours to do what you propose to do. So in terms of the small print, for an STTR, you need to collaborate with an academic. That's essential. For a small SBIR, you don't have to collaborate with an academic, but you can. And there's a certain percentage for both of these grants that you have to do as a small company. And this varies by phase as well. So I've written on this slide a little bit more detail here. So you have to comply with these percentages, otherwise you won't get funded. You have to show that you're doing this in good faith. The SBIR is a little bit special, I think, in a way, because as a company, you could apply for a project for your own company and you can keep all of that money. You don't have to have an academic that gets a piece of it. So that's an important distinction. And an SBIR, you can also make it go over a 6-month period rather than just a year. And so you, in a very short period of time, you could get up to about $250,000 in funding. And that's sort of the maximum amount of money that you can get out of it. Another important point is that after doing a phase 1, if you are successful and you meet all the milestones that you set, and you can then apply for a phase 2 grant, and that is a much higher amount of money for somewhere between 2 to 3 years that you may want to do research on. And that's in the order of about $1.7 million maximum at the moment. There are other types of small business grants. You could go straight into a phase 2, or you could do a fast track, which is a combination of phase 1 and phase 2 grant. These are much more stringent, I think, in terms of requirements of what you need in terms of the amount of preliminary work. And from my experience, I've normally stepped through phase 1 and then phase 2, rather than trying to go straight to phase 2, which is much more ambitious. So I just have a few slides sort of breaking down what it takes to put a grant together. As PJ was saying, these are, there's a lot of work involved in it, and you can't really underestimate how much time it takes to prepare these. Even for a phase 1 application, where the main bulk of it is the strategy, which is a 6-page document where you basically outline sort of the need for whatever it is you're going to develop. That's only 6 pages, but you still have to have cover letter, aims page, summary, narrative, all of these things on the sheet you need to have, as well as bio sketches for the people that are involved, information on the facilities, information about authentication. If you're using animals, you have to have a whole array of information about the justification for use of animals, etc. And one thing probably I should highlight here is letters of support. If you are, for example, working on a rare disease, it's important to have letters of support from that disease foundation or families, because I think they have a lot of impact with the reviewers. Once you have all of this information, there's a system online where you basically wrap all of these pieces together and then submit them through grants.gov. So it is a lot of work. This is not a 1-page application to try to get $250,000 in funding. This is a significant amount of effort that, if I'm honest, if you're doing it for the first time, you at least want to give yourself a month or 2 to prepare for it. And a phase 2 application is all of that, with the added addition that now you've got 12 pages to write on strategy as opposed to 6. And now in this strategy, you've got to lay out how you met the milestones in phase 1, and also where you're planning to go in phase 2 for the next couple of years. So, all of your methods, what you're planning to do, what you're planning to create, what the product is going to be. And in addition to that, you have another 12 pages to write on commercialization. So this is essentially, you've got to have your business plan. Whereas in a phase 1 small business application, you don't have to have a plan. You really don't have to have a business plan figured out. You just have to have a proof of concept idea. In a phase 2, you have to have it. You have to have done the legwork, figured out what the market size is, figured out how you're going to sell it, who's going to sell it, etc. And so in a strategy for a phase 2, it's a lot more detailed really in terms of what you need to put into it, not only the significance of what you're proposing, a little bit on commercialization in the strategy, as well as the 12-page commercialization. And you need to obviously emphasize the areas that are important to these types of grants, such as innovation and significance. These are critical. And then sort of a newer component you need to put in there is the scientific rigor, you know, how are you ensuring quality. In the commercialization document, just a little bit more detail here, finally, you need to lay out the value of the project, you know, not just financial value, but, you know, what's the overall goal of it? You know, it could be the impact it has on the rare disease community, for example, if it's a drug or a device. You need to describe your company in detail, what the plans are for the company, how many employees you have, who they are, your market, the customer. Basically, I would say if you have a full business plan, this is where you would put as much of it as possible. You know, how much money you've brought in, what grants you've been successful in bringing in, and what other sources of revenue you might have. And I think that's basically it. And it's not something that you probably want to go in and just rush and do. I would say that you need to put a lot of thought into doing it, and try to get some advice and get other people to look at it as well. But you also need luck. And so good luck. Give it a try.
Thank you so much. And now we have some time for questions. So as some of the questions that have been, you know, coming in are really thinking about where collaborations with patient advocacy groups might fit in for some of these efforts. You know, so thinking about opportunities, you know, Sean, you mentioned letters of support. One of our attendees, Lisa Schill from the Rasopathies Network, she mentioned that her group actually applies for a particular type of grant called R13s, which is support for scientific conferences. And their group is actually the PIs with academics as co-PIs. So there's a little bit of opportunity to save or be able to not have quite the high level of administrative overhead if it was just going straight to only academic institutions. So I was wondering if everybody might be able to comment just a little bit on thinking about where researchers and patient advocacy groups might be able to collaborate. David, I know you were talking a little bit about that too, but just expand a little bit on those ideas about what kind of role patient groups can play, where researchers might really think of incorporating them and including them. And I think, well, let's start with PJ.
Yeah, so I think the R13, that was the link that I sent around for those conference grants. And I think that's one of the best places where you can do this. I think having the foundation be the PI, I think there are advantages certainly in terms of the overhead. I've also seen though where people have tried that and they ended up running into problems because of just the practicality of submitting a grant, as Sean was laying out. You know, you have to put all these things into a website, and if something goes wrong there and you just pass the deadline, there's nothing you can do. You know, you have to wait till the next time around. Those things are very strict. So I've seen it where people have tried that and ended up getting kind of caught up with that problem. But in general, I think those scientific conference grants are often the best place to start, because if you bring the right scientists and you can kind of develop almost a whole research strategy that might include subsequent grant applications, either small business or other more, you know, clinical trials or typical NIH grants. So yeah, I think that's a great place to start.
Great. David or Sean, would you like to comment a little bit?
I can go ahead, Sean.
No, after you, David.
I would just say that in terms of what we would look for in direct collaboration with patient advocacy groups would be working with us to help provide, to improve the way that we're providing information and knowledge and how to make it practical, as well as there's a couple of research projects that I've alluded to that we're looking to collect unstructured information. So patient stories of how they've, or patient family community stories of how they've navigated learning about a disease and going through the process to help us do a better job of providing tools to help other people navigate, basically kind of incorporating their experience into a system that would automatically provide that for a new entrant into the community.
So I think from my experience, there have been many ways we've been able to engage with, I guess, patient advocacy groups. Initially, one way has been, as I mentioned, talking to them to get letters of support. Another level has been engaging them to try to find out actually how many families may have that disease, or children may have that disease. In particular, if the number isn't clear from the literature, if it's something you can't find. And so getting an accurate idea of number of patients can be critical for some of these types of grants to justify, the patient size. And I think one of the other things that I've seen through collaborations and experience is, once you have these contacts, you find out who the key opinion leaders are from their experience. And so having sort of an insight and also an into that network can be critical. And we found that in the Batten disease community as well, definitely with Sharon King. She's been able to connect us to folks there so that then we've been able to, ask questions. From the chordoma side, we've been connecting with Joan Levy, and we had identified some molecules, and then she was able to leverage the connection she had to a CRO to get some of the drugs tested in animals. So each different patient advocacy group may have different resources available to them, and that may depend on the size, the budget, etc. So it is really important to reach out to them. And obviously, some of them are much broader in the number of diseases they cover as well. So for example, like the MPS Society, there's quite a number of diseases, rare diseases under that umbrella. Whereas obviously if you go to another group like the Chordoma Foundation, that's just chordoma. And the number of patients, may be relatively limited. But each of these is going to be different. I mean, I've I guess, experienced that, just the number of patients is not correlated to what facilities they have or capabilities. I mean, you cannot take them for granted if it's a small foundation, because they may have an incredible patient population, incredible amount of fundraising, and therefore a huge number of facilities open to them. And then, I guess on the other side, if it's a bigger disease, sometimes they don't really have the engagement or all the capabilities there. So yeah, it's really unique. So each disease is kind of a different entry point. And each one may have different things that you may be able to access. And then conversely, you may be able to offer something to them that they don't have. If they don't have like a scientist on board, they may be more of a patient support type of organization. And so if you come in more of trying to do the scientific research, that can actually be valuable to them as well. So it's really, I think, a two-way street. If you're obviously trying to offer bringing in potential treatment for one of these rare diseases, and it's not there, and there's a need for it, I think you obviously should be reaching out to these advocacy groups. I mean, not just for the letter of support, but I think also to engage with them.
Yeah, Maureen, can I, I forgot to mention that is relevant to this. I'm going to put it in the chat there. We have another program at NCATS, which is clinical trial readiness for rare diseases research. And the idea is that these are R21 grants to support some key experiments that will allow you to be ready to get your clinical trial up and running. And there again might be situations where the people who are applying are typically scientists and clinicians, but having contact and participation of the relevant patient advocacy groups would be very valuable, because the whole idea of this is we would like to see that if these experiments get done, a clinical trial is actually going to get off the ground and be feasible. And, you know, once again, showing that you've thought this out and have connections with the relevant patient groups is important. So I just put that link up in the chat as well.
Thank you so much. We did get one question, you know, it would be great to have everybody weigh in very quickly, I think. So, Sean, you went through a great description and overview of SBIRs and STTRs, so small business and innovation research grants and small technology transfer research grants. And you mentioned that there's 5 government sites to register on, and PJ, you also mentioned that there's some things that you have to make sure to not miss deadlines on. And I was wondering if you could just touch on that really quickly, just to give everybody a little bit more context on that.
What I can say is that it's really important you do that, but I only see it from my side, which is after people fill out those things. So Sean might be able to tell you more about what all that stuff is. All I can tell you is you really have to do it, because if you don't do it, we can't even review the grant, and it's very strict. There's no flexibility there. So.
Yeah, so on the RFPs that come through, or RFAs from NIH, for example, it's pretty much in the first few pages. It tells you what registrations you have to have. One of them is obviously grants.gov. Another one is Commons. And grants.gov is basically where you can get the grant package from. Commons is essentially where you have to look at the grant once it's been reviewed. You then can access all of your grants that you've submitted. Another registration is, I guess, Dun & Bradstreet, and I think there's a couple of others as well that you have to do. And it is kind of onerous, because each one of those takes days to sometimes weeks. So, you know, if you're a last minute person and you're submitting this on the deadline, don't do it. You need weeks ahead. You absolutely have to give yourself at least a month to get the registrations done, and then you're set up. And once you've got that, it's very straightforward. But it still takes time, and it is daunting the first time you do it. And I guess over the 15 years that I've been writing grants and submitting them, it's changed a few times. So each time there's another little hurdle you've got to kind of learn, and another system. But once you've got it, and you know how to put in these proposals, you can do it repeatedly. And there's no limit to how many of these you can submit. So that's another thing I should have said. You could definitely submit one grant at a time. And if you've got multiple projects, there's nothing to stop you submitting multiple grants. For the small business grants, there are 3 deadlines every year. Normally that's January 5th, April 5th, and September 5th. And those dates do change depending on if it falls on a weekend. But essentially, you've got 3 opportunities every year to submit these. And the small business grants can be more of an omnibus type of application, or they could be very focused on a specific topic. So you can look for those specific topic grants as well. And those are things that the NIH has, for example, have noted, or whichever organization has noted that they have a need for. And those are very specific applications that you go after, whereas the omnibus grant application is kind of very general.
Yeah, and so one of those that we have, and that I wrote actually is available, is technologies to deliver genome editors to specific cell types. Because as I think you're all aware, that genome editing is a great potential for genetic diseases. And we've got editors that work, and often the problem is how do you get them into the right cell? They seem to, we're pretty good at getting them to go to liver cells, but that's actually sort of a problem because the liver can suck up all of them and then they don't go to other cell types. So that's a specific one that we have right now.
And actually, I'd like to follow up on that. Sean, you gave some really great tips on writing grants and thinking through the process. I was wondering if you might all be able to give kind of one piece or one piece of advice on writing grants. And PJ, I don't know if you want to do this, but if you also wanted to touch on what people might think about in terms of doing some outreach to program managers to explore what they're going to be applying for.
Yeah, so I can answer that one. I think that on all of these funding opportunities, there's somewhere down the bottom, there'll be a contact for a scientific contact, which is usually the person who wrote the funding opportunity. And I'm that person for several of these. And we're there basically to help answer your questions about, as you're thinking about putting in your application. We obviously can't tell you how to write it or write it for you, but we can give you a sense of whether what you're thinking about makes sense in terms of what we're looking for. Because if it's not, then it really isn't worth your time. And, you know, that I think sometimes people neglect that, but we're there to answer your questions. So by all means, contact us and we'll be happy to provide whatever advice we can.
Sean or David, would you have a one piece of advice if you could distill it down to one overarching piece of advice?
I think the most difficult thing is thinking about what if it doesn't work? What if what you proposed doesn't work? You need to have some sort of a backup plan, an alternative. And that's the piece probably that I tend to give the least thought to, but I think it's important because sometimes the experiments don't work. Sometimes the idea you have, doesn't work. So having like a plan B that you can put in there and say, well, if this doesn't work, we've got this other method that we can try. And I think that not only having that in your back pocket shows that you're kind of ready. I think having like a few of those, so you have a plan B and a plan C, that you can just say, we've got these alternative molecules, for example, or we've got these alternative delivery devices. That would be good.
This is, excuse me, this is a little bit outside of the realm of what I've worked with as far as with the InfoHub, but I think I can, just from a general scientific standpoint, second what Sean was saying about understanding what can go wrong, what happens if it doesn't do what you don't get the outcome you expect. And from kind of the history of science perspective, there's been a lot of advances that have happened because something happened that wasn't expected because of a failed experiment or whatever. And I always think about Thomas Edison's anecdotal thing that he didn't fail 10,000 times creating a light bulb. He just figured out 10,000 ways not to do it.
Oh, I think, so we just have a couple minutes left and I wanted to just get one more question in, if that's all right. And this comes from a member of our audience, just in thinking about what kinds of ways could a patient advocacy group help support researchers, and, to find some interest within NIH funding, within some of the centers there. Is there a role for patient advocacy groups that researchers could leverage in that respect?
There certainly is a role. I'm trying to think about how that would fit into the funding opportunities. I mean, we have, it's not so much related to funding, but in our office, the Office of Rare Diseases Research, we do sometimes get family groups coming in who are very new to this whole thing. Maybe they've just had a child diagnosed with a disease and they're trying to figure out, what do I do next? And we certainly can talk to them about that. And we actually have something on our website I'll try to grab the link, which is like a toolkit to help them think about how to go forward with developing a research agenda. So that's something we can provide. It's a little bit different than specifically talking about funding, but it's certainly related. I'll try to find that.
Great, thank you.
I think another thing is just, maybe PJ mentioned it, but knowing the program officer. There are a number of opportunities, I guess, every year, and one of them is Rare Disease Day. So if you are a new rare disease group, try, if you can, to get to DC, assuming that all of this social distancing kind of goes away.
Yeah.
But just networking with a program officer that's specific in your disease area, I think that would be important. So if the disease isn't on their radar, then hopefully it will be after you've met them. And then if you've got a scientist that's working on that disease, and you can kind of, you know, I think it helps having that connection between the Rare Disease Foundation, the scientists, and then also the program officer as well.
And I think that's one of the things that we're envisioning for the InfoHub as we're moving into a bigger, more public launch of things, is that we can be a resource for connecting not necessarily the funding agencies, but advocacy groups with researchers, which can sometimes be hard to find. And if, you know, if it's an unmoderated communication, you know, a person out of the blue emails a researcher at a university, that can be a challenging connection to make. And many times the researcher may not even, it may just be ignored because it's coming from somebody that they don't recognize. And we all get, in the academic world, we get dozens of emails a day from potential students and research collaborators and publication venues and so forth wanting our time. And most of it just gets ignored, frankly, or gets thrown into the spam bucket. But if it's coming through a resource that, like InfoHub, what we're envisioning for InfoHub, where that connection is established and it's kind of vetted a little bit in some respects, then and researchers have expressed an interest in connecting, now we've got a tool that we can make those connections to the benefit of both sides.
Great. Well, that wraps it up. We are just at 12:30 Eastern time, 9:30 Pacific time. So I want to take an opportunity to say thank you so much to PJ, David, and Sean. We really do appreciate your time and for leading a wonderful discussion. And thank you so much to all of the audience participants as well. So now from 12:30 to 1:30 Eastern time, we do have an hour break for lunch, as well as, you know, please be sure to visit the poster hall and the networking lounge. Our next session will begin at 1:30 Eastern time, which is 10:30 Pacific time. And that will be one of our rare rounds, our roundtables. And just as a reminder, in order to access these, please go into the auditorium from the lobby and click on the center logo there for the Rare Drug Development Symposium, and the agenda will pop up. And you can scroll down to the Rare Round session and click join. There'll be a join button today. And a separate window will open up with the roundtable topics. And then you can click the topic that you would like to attend. You'll have to register very quickly. Just add your name and email address and click register, and then we'll send the link in really quickly. It does happen very quickly to join the roundtable session. So thank you all once again. We really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.